This is Dave Monk, Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board.
And Joseph on the camera. And in passing this week, some of you might have gone down Randolph or State. Outside the fire department, there's a flag at half-mast. Bob Pettyjohn passed, and he was sort of the deputy fire department, and for a long time he was in Urbana and then in Champaign, had a lot to do with fire safety, and was quite a personality, and he will be remembered because he had a lot of influence on a lot of people and told them a lot about fire. We probably should do something about fire in the long run. I'm kind of a perpetuator of fire problems because not only do we burn prairies, but we have we salvage, and often salvage goes with flammable materials that need to be corralled and put in the right place so they don't cause a conflict, or confusion. But Bob retired about 6 years ago to the Ozarks and had another life there for a little while that is very well remembered here. And Paul Carson died. He was a musician, an attorney, and he organized the Musicians Union and did a lot of legal work for that sort of organization. So we'll miss him. His son is an artist in the Lincoln Building, just around here. A lot of the people we refer to are people who have been a part of this very community that's around WEFT. We're having some technical difficulties here, so I will continue. This week, coming up on the 25th, we will have the Natural Areas Study Group is running their usual field trips, and so let me have the field trip this week will be to Kickapoo Trail. That chip you have may not be appropriate.
It's okay, keep going. Don't worry.
Okay. We're having difficulties with chips and whatnot for camera. But back to the Natural Area Study Group. It's a group of docent people. Docent is a kind of a broad spectrum name for people who show you around art studios or various places like natural areas, and their intent is to not only to show you but to teach themselves where certain features are that could be interpreted. In this case, it's a natural areas study group, which is very much oriented to knowing about natural areas so that they can be knowledgeable and tell other people about them. And they've been in action over 30 years. It started out at the university within the framework of the curriculum lab, Office of Instructional Resources, environmental studies. We had a group that was mainly students. But then Anne Firehand arrived, and asked if there's anything she could do to help us with our environmental activities. And we were very pleased to have her to organize and formulate the Natural Area Study Group, which she did with a lot of gusto, brought together a lot of people. It became more a community organization, and it's maintained itself for over 30 years, mainly because the members are very interested. They get together, they like to do what they're doing, and they do transmit that information to other people. It's been around long enough that some of the older members have passed and new ones come on board. But it's nice to see that sort of organization continue. What we'll do on Tuesday will be to first of all look at the banner end. We'll start at the banner end. We've talked about this quite a bit on the air and on television, so I'm not going to repeat what we've already said, but we're starting to look at individual structures and where you start and when you finish and things like that. So one of the things we'll look at is probably go up Main Street, have a look at the railroad yards on the north side of of Main Street, and figure out where you might have a starting point for the trail. You don't have to have a big building, you just have to have a place to start. And it's usually appropriate to start in town rather than way out of town where you have to take a car to get to the starting point. So we'll look at the railroad yards. Perhaps there's a big parking lot opposite Solo Cup, which is not greatly used, which might be a starting place where you could park a car if you wanted to. Or it could be that you get there just by walking or by taking a bus or bringing your bicycle. There's next near to that is Weaver Park, which is kind of a remnant with some trees that are savanna trees. They've been there long enough that they're like fluffy clouds in shape rather than tall, thin trees. And they've been preserved, and prairie has been planted around. Then you have to get onto Main Street. And Main Street exits onto 150. And at that point, there's quite a lot of prairie, or was quite a lot of prairie before the road was widened, but there's still elements of it. And we're figuring that you could get on there. The rail trail has, I think, been bought from Route 150, 130. So it's a start next to Walmart. Then you head east, and so we look at the trail. It's been a high embankment. If you have a high embankment, often the local township supervisors carve down the mountain at road places so that cars won't have to dangerously go up and over the railroad and down. But what it makes is for a trail that drops down slowly and goes up slowly. So that's one of the first modifications. There's money come for the first 6 miles. So there's one road east of Walmart, and then there's another road next to the cemetery, Mount Olive, I think it is, at Mayview. And it's on a little knoll, which is always a place for cemeteries because people go there to visit their relatives, and you'll find the older settlement families right on top of the knoll, and then spread out down on the sides. And that's worth a stop for historic purposes, to see who belonged to the Elks or the Modern Woodsmen or the Oddfellows or what was the history, what was the nationality, and so we'll stop there. We go a little further, and there was an elevator at Mayview, which got torn down. It's not there any longer, but there's a parking lot, so you can start on the trail at a different place. You don't have to start at Walmart. That elevator was put up with probably pine, very few knots, and the nails were in nice lines. So we were involved with Roger Miller, who was taking the elevator down, to saw those segments between the nails so you didn't get nails in your chainsaws. And we recycle the wood as ricks of lumber rather than the wood going to the landfill. The elevator had character. It had a little elevator within the elevator which took two people up to the top of the roof so that you could organize the gear head where you change the direction of the grain going in, and you usually had a little house nearby, which if you were lucky enough to have electricity, you had a big motor, and it ran a axle that then ran belts and whatnot to lift buckets of grain up to the gearhead and then into the elevator. If you weren't in that era of electricity yet, and probably this was electrical because you were adjacent to an interurban line which ran on electricity, so the little house next door to the elevator was probably run by electricity, but if not, it would have been run by a motor, and there were various clutches that you could operate from within the elevator, on the floor of the elevator, the deck of the elevator, to activate certain legs. A leg is a place where buckets can come down. You drop all your grain. It's through a grid and a side track that comes through the elevator. You weigh your grain, and then you dump it into the elevator bins, and then the legs take that grain up, and you tend to load various bins evenly so that you don't get one bin heavier than the other. We're in glaciated soil, and if you're not careful and you load just one bin at a time, then the elevator sometimes will fall over. So you have to know a little bit about what you're doing there. So that came down. The children round about had a very friendly groundhog there. It weighed about 40 pounds, was positively huge, and had been well fed. And it's interesting to see that sometimes wild animals can be corralled, but it's not easy. Different types of animals do not necessarily take to being pets, but this one was very friendly. To go along a little further, you come to the end of Mayview, and then you get to Falls. Falls has another elevator, and they wanted to retain the railroad as a short line, but you'll observe there's a number of electrical outlets or posts that belonged to the interurban, and in order to get access to the train and to load properly, they would have had to remove one or two Illinois power poles. These days it's Ameren, but they really wanted an arm and a leg to do that. And the reason is that people have been moving houses. I'm very much in favor of that, but what they find as a problem is that as you move a house, you also have to go under electrical lines. And you do have the possibility of taking a forky stick and pushing the line up and letting the house go through on wheels, which is not really legal. And or you get the power company to come and charge you sometimes a couple of $1,000s to do just that. So I've watched a house being moved in that very area and with those very problems. So eventually Fulls decided they wouldn't go with the railroad, and that's made it possible for the trail to start at Urbana rather than starting at the Fulls elevator. And the Fulls elevator, if they'd taken in rail, would have had the railroad bed back towards St. Joe, east towards St. Joe, about a mile. That's in order to store empty cars while you're loading them. And so usually the line is extended beyond the elevator. Next you come to a grain company that's concerned with genetic grain. They harvest the cobs of corn and carefully load them into this factory. I think it's the Pioneer Grain. I'm not sure I'm remembering right, but I think it's Pioneer Grain. And it's interesting, the semi-trailers that bring these genetic cobs in have a little elevator along the bottom, and that allows them to be put into the elevators that belong to the grain company without damaging them. Across the road, there's a side road. I've explained this before, but it's more functional to put your railroad through at the node of the sigmoid curve of the river. If a river will eventually find its least resistance by doing an S-shaped curve, and you tend to go across that curve at the node rather than at the amplitude, which is high, which moves back and forth. And so if you put your school there, then it's likely that amplitude will get your school someday when there's a flood. So the transportation veers to the south a little bit so that it can go through the node and leave the bottomlands to the north. There used to be a nice row of trees there. I think they got sold. For lumber. The road was made straight through St. Joe. It no longer went through the main street of St. Joe, which is a little bit south. There's always been a drive to have straight roads. It's not as popular as it used to be because it's realized that roads that have a curve in them, or a wiggle woggle or something different, a bit of vegetation, are interesting, and people have less accidents on a curvy road than on a straight road. But this was instituted, so when you go to St. Joe, you go straight in across the amplitude, the wide amplitude area, and it's a bottomland, and the Soil and Water Conservation District and others have been planting that to local trees, and so that will go back to a natural area. The railroad, however, will go back along that road that you have to take separately if you're going to go across the bridge, across the Salt Fork Creek. Before you get there, you'll see some mounds of dirt that have been part of drainage. There's some block drainage there, and there's a puncheon to get rid of that block drainage, so that drains have been taken out. And what the intent is, I think, is to put in what they call a Missouri crossing. So I would like to show people what a Missouri crossing is. It's gently going down like you go across a road and then across the bottomland and up. Not awfully helpful. It's hard enough that we have to go down to roads and up again, because that can be dangerous. If you have children that not necessarily thinking, want to ride a trail and go down on a road, they can very easily have accidents at track of traffic level. So it's wise to keep the railroad bed as intact, as level as possible. There's also the possibility of some idiot with a motorcycle thinking that they can travel that area, and they come to one of these Missouri crossings, and it's growing willows by this time, 10 or 15 years ahead. It's swampy, and you can break your neck in there. So I'm hoping that Forest Preserve, which was receiving the, I think it's $200,000 to put in that trail to about this point. You'll see that the interurban is next door. Some of the gravel from the main line has disappeared. There's a bridge there, which is a steel bridge. And I'd like to introduce people to a bridge. Bridges aren't easy for most people who are not used to heights. So you have to drop ties in between ties so that people don't necessarily look down and see the fish underneath. It's interesting if you're used to it, but you can easily fall off if you're not thinking about things, or someone pushes you off if you are there and having a hot dog picnic. Go back a little bit, and the area between Urbana and this point has quite a lot of prairie on it. Some of it's been taken over by trees, so we have to figure out what do we do. We have a relatively stable soil, so the railroad, when put in, travels in a linear direction and doesn't disturb usually the 40 feet on either side of the railroad bed. We hope that the current development will do the same sort of thing. It will develop it linearly. It doesn't always happen because it's very convenient to park your bulldozer or other heavy equipment on the prairie. Prairie can handle that as long as it's not dug up and herbicided. But in this case, we're having a road widening at the same time as we're having a trail to be established. The two beds are adjacent. The road is to the north, adjacent to the north, and the road has enough right-of-way of its own to widen, so they will probably widen from edge to edge. And there's fiber optics in there that have to be moved. So one way or another, I'm looking for people who will understand the engineering that has to go on. And not everyone likes to think about rails, but this is rail banked. The whole purpose of this interim trail use agreement with the federal government and the railroad and Heartland Pathways is to preserve the railroad. So you have to think about keeping the bed intact in case in 50 or 100 years' time we need to reconstitute the railroad. That's where the money is coming. That's where a lot of the money is coming from. It's from an enhancement. The interim trail use agreement saved the bridges, quieted the titles, and gave money. And I suspect that some of the $200,000 for the trail that's coming from the governor is that a part of it is that enhancement side of money. I hesitate to mention it, but because it's a little disjunct, but there was a possibility of a trail going from Urbana down to Sydney to join the Norfolk Southern Railroad there. And we didn't get that because it was the warranty deeds. It wasn't warranty deeds, it was warranty easements. An easement means that the railroad goes back to the adjacent owner or someone who wants to buy it. And that happened, so we lost that. But you have to know that its entrance into that corridor was moved a couple of times because the train used to go through Urbana, and people didn't like the noise of a train at 2 o'clock in the morning going across, and behind it their home and things like that. So the railroad entrance was moved up to the Solar Cup factory, and the railroad was put in there. So that's still active. The Solar Cup people get their plastic by train. 4 hopper cars would replace 13 semi-trailers with much more safety and less cost. So that is still active, and the railroad yards are still active, and they're used for storage. That if in the future you want to go through to Indianapolis, then these yards are helpful. MTD has taken some of those yards. They've taken the roundhouse and other things, and there are subsidiary industries around there, farm services and the like, that use some of that railroad territory. But the railroad is intact, and often rail cars are parked there when it's off-season and not being used, or when things are being stored. Sometimes there'll be vehicles that have had an accident or something like that. But the yards are active and used not a lot, but we hope that they will remain intact. And that may be also a place where we can get some temporary easements for the use of some of that bed for access to the railroad. The railroad goes back to Dobbins Drive, which is on the west side of Walmart. It's near to Beringer Commons and the housing that's there on 150. And that's, again, keeping the railroad bed a mile past the functional unit, just so that you can park a train if necessary. Some of the track has been taken out, but it may be that we'll want to use some of that track. That might involve another type of easement with the railroad to put a trail across on the railroad bed rather than on Main Street. We don't know. Part of the point of this field trip is to ask you to be involved, ask you to think about what you would want as a trail. So that area between Walmart and Mayview and Fulls and Pioneer Grain is what will be the first piece developed. It'll be about $200,000 put into that. The overall trail will cost us somewhere around 10 or 12 million. So it's a long job, and it's the sort of job that it will be handled by the Champaign Forest Preserve and the Vermilion County Conservation District. Both of those have put in $600,000 each to buy the line. The federal government will give you enhancement money only if you show your involvement by buying the bed. So the bed is bought, and now enhancement money is involved, state money is involved, local money is involved, and CCDC is doing an excellent job of bringing that sort of money together. Let's now go past St. Joe. We don't have money yet for that section, so that might have to wait a few years to get into action. Having access from St. Joe to Urbana is kind of healthy because St. Joe has been growing at a rapid rate. Going east of St. Joe, there's very, very good prairie right at the eastern side of St. Joe. Unfortunately, it has been mowed, and I suspect it has been herbicided. So that rather unique prairie, which goes along with the other prairies between around about the Pioneer Grain and going back to the cemetery and back into Urbana. good little plots of prairie, and the Committee on Natural Areas out of the Graduate College of the university used to have an agreement with the railroad lines to use those areas for research. So I'm hoping that we get an ecological assessment of that general area, and that is, I expect, to be part of the rail trail restoration. It's railroad and greenways. And then we also want to know that the roadside people will not be planting things like sweet clover and vetch and brome grass, which will invade the prairie. So that is heavy-duty politics, folks. So we need your involvement to think about that. Going east, we have also the same sort of quality prairie. The road goes into an S-curve and goes up and over the Union Pacific Railroad bed. When we went to Conrail to sort this out in the first place, Conrail said they would virtually give us the line except for a bridge over Union Pacific. The railroads, the mainline railroads, do not enjoy people going across at grade. And that's what used to happen with the railroad. There's a diamond there. And diamonds are things that wear out a lot. It's one-way road crossing another. You can hear, sometimes you can hear, if I'm standing outside WEFT, you can hear the train crossing the diamond that is just north of on Market Street. It's a huge amount of bump and grind, and if it wears out, it has to be replaced. So the first thing to do when the Conrail closed out, the diamond was taken out. And the railroad does not want bicycles going across 1 or 2 or 3 railroad lines and creating a liability. So somehow we have to have a bridge that goes up and over that site. The railroad is 1 and 2 lines at the moment, but if railroad continues to increase its traffic, then they may want 3 lines. That means you have to have I-beams that are long. You have to have an expensive bridge. Unfortunately, the S-shaped bridge, road bridge that goes up and over, is a fairly new one. If we'd realized that we were going to do this, we would have probably asked for a bicycle lane on the bridge. But that didn't happen. So it might be, in retrospect, we can put a outrigger on the bridge. But if you go down underneath the bridge, you may have to come up under the road bridge and then up over the railroad and down the other side. And I suspect that that's probably a $1.5 million job. It's an expensive one. So we'll stop there and look at it and figure out what you can do to encourage something that's reasonable in that situation. You cannot go down because the land is so swampy, glacially, that we drained this area extensively. So if you go down, you will have a drain there. It's a little bit like we often have to have sump pumps on underpasses because they collect water. So going down is not good, and also down can be a place where people can hide, so you have to have power in to light it, and so it's usually going up and over. It can be a lightweight bridge. It doesn't have to be a road bridge if you're going to put bicycles on it. It depends a little bit whether you want to let motorized vehicles on it. If you're in Wisconsin, sometimes in some places, motorized vehicles are allowed, like certain types of motorized vehicles, like golf carts or motorcycles, probably, if they behave themselves. And usually people who use these trails do behave themselves. One of the dangers is for the first 15 years, before the trail becomes really a part of the community, there are people who can do untoward things with the land, and we want to discourage that. That means that we need some of you out there actually walking and looking at the line. The area between that bridge and Ogden is interesting because it is heavily covered with trees, but underneath the trees are all sorts of prairie species. Some people who live near the line feel that they have to mow it, but if it were not mown and if it were handled carefully, the prairie would come back. If we take a right, we go down and you start to look at the area 5 miles on either side of the railroad bed, because that's what you're talking about. You're talking about a track that has features. And so if you turn right there, you go down past Yeoman's and you go to an area that was owned by the Clark family. And the Clark family was supportive of an old Homer Lake. Homer used to be on the Salt Fork, so you're heading south towards the Salt Fork, and you see the new Homer Lake, which is further north, where there was a dam put in. And then you waddle around the river, adjacent to the river, to the road that runs between Ogden and Homer, and you realize that there used to be a covered bridge there. There's an old cemetery. And this is where Homer was before it was moved south. When the railroad came by about a mile south of this site, the old Homer Park, the frame houses were skidded across the land on the ice and put in place at the new railroad line. The only ones that weren't skidded were the ones that were brick. It is very hard to move a brick building, especially if it's old brick and it has old mortar. If you have lime and a little bit of hog's hair and whatnot, you can very easily lift a brick building up by one corner and it can all collapse. So the brick buildings are still there. There's a little dam that was creating a place for recreation. You probably had a bear and a deer and a few other animals. You had places for foot races. There was a butcher shop there. And there was a railroad line that came down from Ogden. So we're going around to Ogden on a back road. And so that's one of those sorts of interesting places where you'd get off the rail trail and go looking at other things. Come back up the rail. The rail bed is still visible, but it is now used for agriculture. But it goes into Ogden, and then you have to look at the buildings in Ogden because a tornado came through there several years ago, and you can see that the community is not quite resolved that situation. And there's no elevator anymore. I think the elevator came down. But a little look at Ogden is interesting. Go a little further north, you find picnic grounds on tributaries of the Salt Fork that come in and meet the Salt Fork and flow through toward Danville on the south side. So now we'll come back at Ogden, and we move through Ogden carefully, and we come to the Vermilion County line. There's Mr. Esworthy, who lives on the south side, and there's good prairie there. And the interurban is now on the south side of the line. So we're going toward Fifth Inn, and we go past Rumpler. Rumpler has a square elevator. People have tried to buy it. It's not the world's greatest elevator because square is not as strong as round. But there's a collection of little houses, 2 or 3 houses, and that's where you can have another experience. go along to the next elevator, and I'm forgetting the name of the community there, but it had a spur line for fertilizer and those sorts of things, and it had the interurban actually had a spur you could load grain onto the interurban. Interurban rails are usually fairly light, so you don't put very big hopper cars on there. Like you don't put a 100-ton hopper car on there. You have smaller ones, and you could take grain into Champaign with what is called a slug. A slug is an electrified unit that has a lot of batteries in it, if I remember rightly, and it can actually work a diesel-electric engine and take out grain. Passenger trains don't need that sort of slug. They have catenaries overhead, and you can get your electricity from the catenary. So now we're coming into Fithian, and Fithian has a very nice interurban railroad station or depot. It happens to be on the south side of 150, and it's been done up very well by two people who live in and have been like a school superintendent and people in that area. So you have an operational center tower, and you can see where the electricity goes into be boosted for the next section of railroad or interurban. They put copper piping on the gutters. They've re-roofed the building, and they've added an adjacent building that's almost identical to the railroad. So it's been done historically. And we're very pleased with that. But that would be a stopping point where we'll look at that and let you see what some of the features are that are interesting. We'll move along a little further to Muncie. And at Muncie, we may take a dogleg south, because the Lincoln Trail is running about 5 miles to the south. Might not be quite 5 miles, but you're starting to get into mining area. This is a different sort of geology. Your communities came in from Kentucky and places to the south where they were used to mining. So many of the people that are in Danville and surrounding areas are from that sort of background and probably have a heavy Irish or German background. They were the people who had 5-acre lots and had donkeys or burros or horses that could be used in deep mining. But after that came a period where there was strip mining. So you took off the overburden like you were plowing the soil, exposed the coal underneath, dug out the coal, and then did another strip. And so that area is a little further along. You go through Muncie. If we go south on Muncie, we go past an area that was developed. It had a raceway for a mill and a covered bridge at Conkytown, and that is worth a look at. So we may go through to Oakwood. We can follow through Bronson, which was where a railroad line used to go through from south to north, and it's been returned to farming now, so you don't even notice it's there. But this is where Doris Westfield picked a lot of her prairie seed to provide for a natural prairie in the Vermilion County Conservation District. Some of that area is being mown or herbicided and that's what we have to watch. If in the first period, first 15 years, you have to be sure that you're watching the locals and what they do with the bed, because if they've been sitting on it for a while, they figure that they own it and they can do what they like, and villagers think that mowing is good, so they can mow it. So you have to have some diplomacy here. Often the railroad beds of this nature have an overall agency. It's called an authority, a railroad authority, a little bit like MTD. It's specifically designed to bring in a number of different people, whether it's biologists or farmers that were upset with things. And often they get converted because they realize the importance of the genetic material to save the prairie that's on those beds. Sometimes it's historians. At Bronson, there's someone who is into gnomes, and outside his house there are all sorts of little creatures. And you probably don't really want that, because he's been herbiciding the railroad bed to make it neat and tidy. But we have to point out that railroad bed is where we grow our gene pool. That's where we have original soils, and please could we not do that? The township supervisor is right there. So we have a lot of educating to do, and there has to be funding to do that. In the first place, we as innovators of this corridor need to fund people who will run back and forth and get to know the adjacent owners and who they are and what they think and what they want to do, talk to local jurisdictions and the like. That costs money. And if we don't get any recognition for that, then we don't get that sort of support. CCDC has wanted to take over, but Conrail said, if you do it quickly, you'll preserve it, but if you don't, CSX will buy, and CSX did buy, and then wanted to charge an arm and a leg for that area. So we already had, by this time, 33 miles in the Monticello area, so we knew what we were doing, and CCDC has eventually gotten a sale with CSX, and CSX has gotten some tax write-off. But we'll talk about that a little bit too, not too much, because we're basically looking at engineering and what you do. How do you maintain the corridor as a railroad and use it as a trail? And there's not everyone believes in a trail. There's a lot of money involved. Could that money be spent on something else? It's usually line item money, so you can't use it for anything else. And the general opinion seems to be that the trail is ideal. Now, where were we at? Near to Oakwood. Oakwood is getting near to Kickapoo State Park, and people who work in Kickapoo State Park live there. But you go south, there's a place called Mission Field, and we'll take a road there and you look over the pollywogs. The pollywogs is one of these places where you plow the ground, expose the coal, and then take out the coal, then plow the next furrow. So the last furrow is usually a very deep one, and it's full of water. The water is usually black. It takes it 70, 100 years to start to get biodiversity. If you take a clamshell, if you take a boat and you have a clamshell and you want to sample that water, you take the clamshell down and it grabs a bunch of the material down there and brings it up, and you put it in a little sieve and you sieve out and you find all the microorganisms, and you're probably losing a whole bunch of bacteria. But early on, you only have a few species. Later, it starts to get biodiverse. But there's a lot of sulfur in the mullock that has been brought up as overburden, or that has been avoided by plowing it over. And that sulfur makes the water acid, and it's going to be a long while before that returns to vegetation. The Peabody and the like that are miners there are federally controlled, and they have to put in trees, replacement trees, but the replacement trees don't always grow very well. They meet the letter of the law, but those furrows are still seeable, and they're pretty specific to mining. In some places they get smoothed out and buildings put on them, but they're also fairly unstable. So if you do put a building on it, you have to realize that your concrete slab has to be able to dance without cracking. We're going through to Muncie. Now, Muncie has a little rock creek that comes down and goes under the 150 and swings around as a meander and comes back in. That area was cut off, so they made a shortcut for the water, which makes it a little dangerous, but you have to watch those bridges. You have to see that after a thunderstorm, they're not washed out. Somebody's got to look after this stuff and surveil it. And this is the job of the Forest Preserve or the conservation people in Vermilion County. And I'm sure that will be done well, but it doesn't hurt the public to be aware of what this resource is and what is happening. If we go south to Mission Field, we'll pull back out and go around by the Possum Trot and some interesting entries into Danville. There's a huge bridge there, 160 feet off the ground, and it will require something like $2 million to put it into action so bicycles can go across. It's near the county fairgrounds. It runs right into the Kickapoo State Park. So that's where we'll go on Tuesday, the 25th at 9 a.m. And we'll be doing one of those things that the Natural Areas Study Group does regularly. I have here a list of what the Natural Areas Study Group does. Perhaps I don't have.
Well, you're looking for it, so people need to get to Anita Purvis. Will you have vehicles enough to get the entire crowd
Usually
that might show up?
They have a group of vehicles and they carpool. And it's helpful for people who don't have a lot of time. If they need to come back, they can escape.
So about how long, what would be the longest time for the most persistent people to go the full distance?
Well into lunch. So bring a lunch and bring munchies and water.
But as you say, if you know that you don't have time for the full-length thing, make sure you've got your own vehicle so that you can come back home
there
again.
There are probably one or two people that want to do that, so they carpool in that manner. So 9 a.m. at Anita Purvis on Tuesday. And Natural Areas Study Group goes to a whole bunch of different places. They've Collison Marsh or Weldon Springs, or a whole lot of natural areas around, and they do a tremendous job of doing that. They spend one meeting organizing the spring retinue of places to go to. And we're encouraging you to be a member of the Natural Areas Study Group. It doesn't cost you very much. They have to pay a little bit towards the use of the building at Anita Purvis for meetings, and that can be taken out in quid pro quo. You can do some community work with the Forest Preserve or the Park District or what have you to contribute to that cost. So we're nearing the end of the time. A reminder again, Tuesday, 25th, 9 a.m., and I'll try to have some information there, like maps and charts to let you know where you are and what you're doing and how you get into Danville. At the Danville end, you've got to think about how you get through Hillary and into Danville. So this has been Prairie Monk, Dave Monk, 90.1 on your FM dial and streamed worldwide